My own mother looked me dead in the eyes across a crowded high-end steakhouse and announced to our entire family that she wished I was never born. I did not cry. I did not scream or cause a scene. I just stood tall, looked at their shocked faces, and told them to consider their wish granted. Live your lives as though there was never a daughter named Claire, I said. Then I dropped a single manila folder on the table that turned their luxurious fake lives into an absolute nightmare. The whole party froze as I walked out the door. The evening was supposed to be a celebration of my resilience. I am 35 years old, and for the past 5 years I have sacrificed my sleep, my social life, and my peace of mind to earn my Master of Business Administration. I did not take out loans. I did not ask for handouts. I paid for every single credit hour out of my own pocket while working grueling 60-hour weeks as a wealth manager at a top financial firm here in Atlanta. Getting through that program as a Black woman in a highly competitive male-dominated industry took everything I had. I navigated corporate microaggressions by day and buried my face in financial textbooks by night. So when my mother Valerie offered to host a family dinner at Chop's Lobster Bar to celebrate my graduation, I foolishly allowed myself to believe that my family was finally ready to acknowledge my hard work. I should have known better. In my family, excellence was only celebrated if it belonged to my younger sister Maya. Walking into the dimly lit mahogany-paneled dining room of the steakhouse, I could already feel the familiar weight of my family, us toxic dynamics settling over my shoulders. We were a party of 12 occupying a large circular table right in the center of the room. My father Winston sat at the head of the table nursing a glass of scotch that cost more than my first car. He wore his custom-tailored suit, projecting the image of a flawless, wealthy patriarch to anyone who happened to glance our way. My mother sat to his right, draped in silk and pearls, surveying the room with the practiced arrogance of a woman whose entire identity revolved around social status and keeping up appearances at our local megachurch. And then there was Maya. She sat directly across from me, dripping in designer labels, clutching the arm of her white husband, Connor. The family treated Connor like absolute royalty. Whenever he spoke, no matter how profoundly mediocre his opinions were, my parents hung on his every word. He had this irritating habit of using forced, culturally appropriated slang around us, trying far too hard to prove how comfortable he was in a Black family. Maya enabled his behavior completely, treating him like a trophy that elevated her own status. To my parents, Maya and Connor represented the perfect image of modern success. They lived in a sprawling 5-bedroom house in a gated suburban community, drove luxury leased vehicles, and posted their meticulously curated lives on social media every single day. From the moment we sat down, the disrespect was palpable. Nobody asked to see my diploma. Nobody asked about the senior partner track I was currently interviewing for at my firm. Instead, Connor immediately took charge of the wine list, ordering 3 bottles of a reserve Cabernet without even glancing at the prices. My aunts and uncles chimed in, ordering massive tomahawk steaks, lobster tails, and endless arrays of expensive side dishes. I sat quietly, sipping my water and eating a modest filet, watching my family treat my graduation dinner like their personal all-you-can-eat buffet. I tried to initiate conversation about my final thesis project, hoping to share a piece of the academic journey that had consumed my life for half a decade. I turned to my aunt and began explaining the economic forecasting model I had developed, but before I could finish my second sentence, my mother cleared her throat loudly. She picked up her crystal glass and tapped it lightly with her butter knife. The sharp, clear, ringing sound instantly commanded the table's attention. The low hum of conversation faded, and my family turned their faces toward Valerie. I felt a brief, foolish flutter of hope in my chest. I straightened my posture, preparing a modest smile, thinking that finally, after all the years of being pushed to the background, my mother was going to say she was proud of me. Valerie stood up, smoothing the front of her silk blouse. She raised her glass, looking past me entirely, and locked her glowing eyes on my sister. "I want to propose a toast," my mother announced, her voice carrying a theatrical warmth designed to attract the attention of the surrounding tables. "Tonight we are gathered to celebrate something truly special. Maya and Connor have just informed Winston and me that they are expanding their family portfolio. They are currently looking into purchasing a second home, a vacation property down in Florida, to build real generational wealth for their future children. To Maya and Connor, the pride of this family, my heart dropped into my stomach. I sat completely frozen as my father raised his scotch glass and cheered. My aunts and uncles clapped enthusiastically, offering loud congratulations. Maya offered a bashful, performative smile, resting her head on Connor Yu's shoulder, while he grinned and took a large gulp of the expensive wine he had just ordered. They were hijacking my graduation dinner to celebrate my sister US imaginary real estate ventures. The utter humiliation washed over me, hot and suffocating. I looked down at my plate, my hands trembling slightly in my lap. For a moment, the old familiar urge to shrink myself took over. The urge to stay quiet, to swallow the disrespect just to keep the peace. But I thought about those late nights at my desk, the sheer exhaustion I pushed through to earn my degree, and the quiet dignity I had maintained while my family treated me like a second-class citizen in my own life. I was 35 years old. I was a licensed wealth manager. I was done shrinking. "Mom," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. The table fell silent. My mother lowered her glass, her eyes narrowing as she looked down at me. I continued fighting the tremor in my chest. "I am happy for Maya and Connor, I truly am. But you invited me here tonight to celebrate my MBA. Could we perhaps focus on the occasion we actually gathered for?" The temperature at the table plummeted. My aunts exchanged uncomfortable glances. Connor shifted in his seat, looking mildly annoyed that the spotlight had shifted away from him. Valerie let out a sharp, dismissive scoff that echoed in the quiet dining room. She rolled her eyes, her lips twisting into a sneer of pure disdain. "You always have to make everything about you, Claire. You are so terribly insecure. It is exhausting." I stared at her, genuinely shocked by the blatant gaslighting. Making it about me. "It is literally my graduation dinner." "It is just a piece of paper," Claire, my mother, fired back, her voice raising a fraction, losing its refined edge. "So you read some books and took some tests. Congratulations. But Maya and Connor are out here making real moves. They are building a real family, securing actual assets. You should be taking notes instead of demanding applause for doing what you are supposed to do." Connor leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table with an arrogant smirk. "Look, Claire," he said, using that condescending tech bro tone he always weaponized against me. "School is great and all, but real wealth is built in the market. Maya and I are making strategic investments. You are just accumulating degrees. When you get out into the real world of asset management, you will understand." The absolute audacity of this man lecturing me on asset management took my breath away. He had no idea who he was talking to. He had no idea what I actually did for a living, because nobody in this family ever bothered to ask. I knew exactly what Connor strategic investments looked like, but I kept my mouth shut. I refused to give them the reaction they were so desperately trying to provoke. Before I could respond, the waiter approached our table. He carried a heavy black leather billfold. Without a word of hesitation, he walked directly past my father, bypassed Connor, and placed the billfold gently on the table right next to my water glass. I looked at the waiter, then looked across the table at my mother. Valerie was watching me with a look of supreme satisfaction. "Since you are the big, successful corporate woman now," my mother said, her tone dripping with venom, "we figured it was only right that you treat your family to dinner. Consider it a thank you for all the support we have given you over the years." I reached out and opened the leather folder. The printed receipt stared back at me, and $1,247. They had deliberately ordered the most expensive items on the menu. They had celebrated Maya, praised Connor, completely erased my achievement. And now they expected the single supposedly bitter sister to foot the bill for her own humiliation. I looked around the table. My father was purposely looking the other way. My aunts were suddenly very interested in their empty dessert plates. Maya was hiding a smirk behind her napkin. I did some quick mental math. I reached into my designer tote bag and pulled out my wallet. I did not pull out my black corporate card. Instead, I withdrew 2 crisp $20 bills and a single $5 bill. I placed the $45 neatly on top of the receipt. "That covers my filet and my sparkling water, including a 20% tip," I said, my voice eerily calm. I closed the leather folder and slid it across the large circular table. It came to a stop right in front of Connor U.S. plate. Since you are the one building generational wealth, Connor, you can cover the rest. The silence that fell over the table was absolute. Connor's arrogant smirk vanished instantly. He stared at the leather folder, as if it were a venomous snake, his face flushing a deep mottled red. He looked at Maya in sheer panic, and Maya looked at my mother. Valerie slammed her hands down on the table, causing the silverware to rattle. Claire, you pick that check up right now. Do not you dare embarrass this family in public. You are paying this bill. I picked up my purse and stood up, smoothing the front of my dress. I am not paying for your disrespect, Mom. I am not funding Maya's lifestyle, and I am certainly not subsidizing Connor's delusions of grandeur. My mother lost whatever remained of her composure. The mask of the devout, perfect high society matriarch completely shattered. She pointed a shaking finger at my face, her voice rising to a volume that caused diners at adjacent tables to turn and stare. You are nothing but a jealous, bitter, miserable woman. She hissed, her eyes burning with a hatred so deep it physically took my breath away. You have always been a burden. We have to walk on eggshells around your fragile ego while you contribute nothing to this family. You want to know the truth, Claire. You want the absolute truth tonight. We wish you were never born. The words hit the air like physical blows. My father flinched but said nothing. Maya looked down, her eyes wide. The entire restaurant seemed to freeze, the ambient noise dying out completely. Everyone was waiting for me to break. They were waiting for the tears, the screaming, the emotional collapse that would finally validate their narrative of me being an unstable, angry black woman. I did not give them the satisfaction. I felt a cold, pristine clarity wash over my entire body. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me, feeling absolutely nothing but pity. Consider me as if I never existed. I said, my voice steady and crystalline. Live your lives as though there was never a daughter named Claire. Wish granted. I reached into my tote bag one last time. My fingers brushed against the thick, heavy stock paper of the manila envelope I had brought with me tonight. An envelope that was originally supposed to be a gift. I pulled it out and tossed it onto the center of the table. It landed directly on top of Maya's expensive silk clutch. I held her gaze as she cautiously reached out and opened the flap. She pulled out the legal documents inside. What is this? Maya asked, her voice trembling slightly as she scanned the bold legal header printed at the top of the page. It is a 30-day notice to vacate, I replied calmly. Connor snatched the paper from her hands, his eyes darting frantically across the text. This is a joke, he stammered, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. This is an eviction notice for our house. You cannot do this. You do not own our house. A corporate management company owns our house. I looked at him, letting a small, razor-sharp smile touch the corners of my mouth. I am the sole managing member of that LLC, Connor. I own the debt you defaulted on 2 years ago. I own the roof over your head. And as of midnight tonight, your lease is terminated. You have 30 days to get off my property. I did not wait for the screaming to start. I turned my back on my shocked, paralyzed family and walked calmly out of the restaurant, stepping into the warm Atlanta night air, breathing freely for the first time in my life. The thick, humid Atlanta air hit my face the second I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the restaurant. I handed my ticket to the valet with hands that were completely steady. I did not shed a single tear. I just wanted my car. I wanted to drive back to my penthouse, take a long shower, and wash the toxic scent of that dining room off my skin. Claire. The voice cracked like a whip across the pavement. I turned to see my father Winston storming out of the restaurant. His custom-tailored suit jacket was unbuttoned and flapping in the wind. His face was flushed a deep, angry purple under the warm glow of the streetlights. He marched straight up to me, invading my personal space, pointing a thick finger just an inch from my nose. What kind of sick, twisted game are you playing in there? He demanded. I did not even bother to lower his voice. The valet stopped moving, his eyes darting between us. Printing out fake legal documents just to ruin your sister U.S. night. Winston continued, his voice dripping with absolute disgust. You are so consumed by your own bitter jealousy that you would actually fabricate an eviction notice. You are a psychotic, miserable woman. You cannot stand to see Maya happy. I looked at the finger pointed at my face. I did not swat it away. I did not flinch. I just stared at it until he slowly lowered his hand, unnerved by my complete lack of a reaction. Fake documents, I asked, my voice cutting through the humid air like shattered glass. Winston, I am a licensed wealth manager. I handle multi-million-dollar portfolios every single day. I do not forge documents. You should know that better than anyone, considering you are the one who came begging to my office 2 years ago. His face faltered. The righteous anger shifted instantly into something else. Panic. Keep your voice down, he hissed, glancing around the valet stand nervously. I will not, I replied, stepping forward so he was forced to step back. Since we are airing out the family laundry tonight, let us put it all on the line. Let us talk about Connor, us brilliant tech startup. The one you bragged about to every single deacon at our church. The one you proudly funded to make sure your white son-in-law looked like a genius to the rest of Black Atlanta. The one that went completely bankrupt 24 months ago. Winston swallowed hard. The color began to drain from his face, leaving him looking older and suddenly very fragile. Connor blew through all his investor funding, I said, making sure my articulation was razor sharp. Maya U.S. luxury house, the one she just claimed she is building generational wealth inside of, went into active foreclosure. The bank was 30 days away from throwing their designer furniture onto the curb. And who did you call Dad? You did not call your golf buddies. You did not call the pastor. You called the daughter you just allowed your wife to disown. I let the truth hang there in the heavy night air. I watched his eyes dart back and forth as the reality of the situation finally penetrated his arrogance. You sat in my office and cried, I continued. You begged me to fix it because you could not bear the social humiliation of Maya losing her home. You could not stomach the idea of your country club friends finding out that Connor was a financial failure. So I fixed it. I used my private LLC. I took my own post-tax money, the money I earned working 60-hour weeks, while you all mocked my career, and I bought their defaulted debt at a public auction for pennies on the dollar. I saved them from immediate homelessness. I own the paper. I own the dirt under their feet. Winston opened his mouth, but no words came out. He just stared at me, his chest heaving. I reached into my designer tote bag and pulled out a second envelope. This one was thick and pristine white. Do you know what this is? I asked, tapping the white envelope against my palm. This is the deed transfer. I brought it with me tonight. My plan was to pay for the graduation dinner, announce my MBA, and hand Maya the house free and clear. I was going to give her a $500,000 asset as a celebration of family. I was going to wipe her slate clean. I walked over to a heavy metal trash can sitting next to the valet podium. I held his gaze as I dropped the white envelope right into the garbage. But then Mom wished I was never born, I said, my tone completely devoid of emotion. And Connor decided I was just a degree hoarder who needed to foot a $1,200 bill for a celebration that erased my existence. So the gift is canceled. The eviction stands. They have 30 days to get out of my house. I expected shame. I expected my father to apologize, to realize the sheer magnitude of what they had just thrown away because of their own petty cruelty. I expected him to beg for my forgiveness on behalf of my mother and sister. Instead, his posture stiffened. The panic vanished from his eyes, replaced immediately by an entitlement so deep and so toxic it made my stomach turn. He puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim his authority as the patriarch. You pull that envelope out of the trash right now, Winston ordered, his voice dropping into a menacing growl. You are going to sign that deed over to Connor and Maya tonight. That is family property, Claire. You have no right to hold it hostage. Family property. I repeated the words slowly, letting the sheer absurdity of his demand settle into the thick Georgia night. The sheer audacity of my father demanding I hand over a $500,000 asset as if it were a borrowed sweater was staggering. There is no family property, Winston. There is only my private LLC, my capital, and a heavily leveraged house that your son-in-law defaulted on. You do not get to claim the fruits of my labor just because we share DNA. The heavy glass doors of the steakhouse swung open again. Connor stepped out onto the pavement. He wore a tailored blazer without a tie, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of his expensive slacks. He was projecting that effortless, relaxed confidence he always used to manipulate my parents. Maya trailed just behind him, clutching her silk wrap, looking like a distressed damsel who needed her knight to handle the unruly help. Whoa, hey, let us all just take a breath, Connor said, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. He walked toward me with that infuriating, condescending smile. He used the exact same tone a person might use to calm down a toddler having a public tantrum. Claire, come on. We are all family here. There is no need to make a huge scene and overreact like this. You are highly emotional right now because of the dinner, and I completely get it. But let us be rational. There it was. The classic weaponization of my emotions. He was trying to paint me as the irrational, angry black woman who just could not understand the complex world of business. He wanted to minimize my perfectly calculated financial maneuver as a hysterical outburst. Overreacting. I felt the fire ignite in my chest, but I kept my voice freezing cold. You think I am overreacting? Look, Connor chuckled, a soft, patronizing sound. I know the startup hit a little speed bump. Tech is volatile. But Maya and I are pivoting. We have new angel investors lined up for next quarter. You holding on to this deed is just petty. It is just bad business. So why do not we go back inside, order some dessert, and we can draw up a quick transfer agreement? I will even let you keep a 5% equity stake for your trouble. He actually thought he could buy me off with a 5% stake in my own property. He thought he could use generic corporate buzzwords to intimidate me into handing over a house I owned outright. Connor, I said, stepping right into his line of sight, forcing him to drop the relaxed posture. You do not have angel investors. You have a series of defaulted mezzanine loans, 2 outstanding liens from unpaid contractors, and a credit score that is currently sitting in the low 500s. You did not hit a speed bump. You drove your company straight into a brick wall because you lack basic financial literacy. His patronizing smile completely vanished. The color drained from his face as I recited his exact financial ruin right there in the valet line. I am not your subordinate. I continued, my voice echoing off the concrete. I am not one of the naive interns you managed to scam into working for free. I am a licensed wealth manager holding a Master of Business Administration. I manage 9-figure portfolios. I know exactly what your debt-to-income ratio is because I hold the paper on your primary residence. Your liquidity is non-existent. You are not pivoting. You are broke. And more importantly, you are my tenant. Winston tried to step between us. Claire, you will not speak to him that way. I will speak to him exactly the way his creditors speak to him. I shot back, not breaking eye contact with Connor. Let me make this crystal clear, so there is no confusion, no gaslighting, and no more delusions about generational wealth. The eviction notice you left on your plate is completely legal, fully processed, and actively ticking down. You have exactly 30 days to vacate my property. If you leave a single scratch on the hardwood floors, my legal team will sue you for damages. Maya finally spoke up, her voice trembling with manufactured tears. You cannot do this to me, Claire. My entire life is in that house. My church study group meets there. Where are we supposed to go? What am I supposed to tell people? Tell them the truth. Maya, I told my sister, feeling absolutely no pity for the woman who had spent my entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself. Tell them your sister bought your house at a foreclosure auction because your husband is a fraud. You better start packing because the county sheriff will be at that front door on day 31 to escort you off the premises. Maybe you can move into the guest room at Mom and Dad Yu's house, assuming they can afford to feed you. The sound of heels aggressively clicking against the pavement made me turn my head. Valerie marched out of the restaurant. She had left her polite church-going persona completely behind in the dining room. Her eyes were dark, burning with a vindictive rage that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. She stormed past the valet, ignoring the small crowd of onlookers who had gathered to watch the wealthy family implode outside of the restaurant. She stopped right beside Winston, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at my chest. You listen to me, you ungrateful wretch! Valerie hissed, her voice shaking with raw malice. You think you hold all the cards because you bought one piece of property. You think you can disrespect your father, humiliate your sister, and threaten my family without consequences. You are not my family, I replied smoothly. You made that abundantly clear tonight. You just made the biggest mistake of your pathetic life. Valerie spat, stepping so close I could smell the expensive wine on her breath. You want to play the ruthless corporate executive. Fine. We will see how much power you really have by Monday morning. I promise you, Claire, by the time we are done with you, you will not have a job, you will not have a dime, and you will be begging us to take you back." She grabbed Winston by the arm and signaled for Maya and Connor to follow. "We are leaving. I will not spend another second breathing the same air as this toxic mistake of a daughter." I stood my ground watching them pile into Winston U.S. luxury sedan. I did not flinch at the threat. I watched the taillights of their car disappear into the Atlanta traffic, completely unaware of the absolute hell they were about to rain down on my life. I slid into the driver's seat of my car, letting out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 35 years. The adrenaline was still pumping through my veins, but my hands were remarkably steady. Before I could even put my car into drive, my cell phone lit up the dark interior. The caller ID flashed my father's name. I should have ignored it, but I pressed answer and put it on speaker. Winston U.S. voice was deathly quiet. It was completely stripped of all the screaming and bluster from the parking lot. He sounded calculating and cold. He told me I had fundamentally misunderstood the power dynamics of the city we lived in. He asked if I remembered a man named Carlton Sterling. I did. Carlton was a senior board member at my wealth management firm, and more importantly, he was my father's U.S. longtime golf partner at their exclusive country club. Winston explicitly outlined his plan right there on the phone. He told me that if I did not void the eviction notice and sign the house deed over to Connor, by Monday morning he was going to call Carlton. He promised to report me for unethical and predatory business practices. He said he would tell the board that I was illegally leveraging my financial expertise to exploit and extort my own family. He warned me that the financial sector relies entirely on trust and reputation, and he was more than willing to destroy mine. He promised to end the career I had just spent 5 years shedding blood, sweat, and tears to build. I listened to his entire threat without interrupting. When he finally finished breathing heavily into the receiver, I just shook my head. I told him he was bluffing. I reminded him of how deeply he cared about his image in our community. I told him he would never risk his own pristine public reputation by admitting to his elite country club friends that his golden white son-in-law was a bankrupt failure living in a foreclosed home. I told him he was too obsessed with keeping up appearances to ever expose his own financial mess just to spite me. I hung up the phone before he could respond. I switched my phone to Do Not Disturb, tossed it into the passenger seat, and drove out of the restaurant parking lot into the warm night. The entire weekend I enjoyed the profound silence. I ordered expensive takeout, poured myself a glass of aged wine, and watched the Atlanta skyline from my penthouse balcony. I genuinely believed I had won. I thought my father was far too proud to ever let the world know his family was anything less than perfect. I severely underestimated the depths of their vindictiveness. I did not realize that they would gladly burn their own house to the ground as long as I was trapped inside the flames. Monday morning arrived crisp and bright. I dressed in my sharpest tailored suit, feeling a renewed sense of purpose and absolute clarity. The toxicity was finally cut out of my life, and I was ready to step into my new chapter as a fully credentialed corporate graduate. I walked into the soaring glass atrium of my financial firm, holding my head high. I grabbed my usual morning coffee, greeted the security guards by name, and stepped into the elevator, riding it up to the executive floor. I approached the heavy glass doors of my department, mentally preparing for my morning client meetings. I pulled my lanyard from my pocket and tapped my employee keycard against the security scanner. The light blinked red. The scanner emitted a sharp, flat denial tone. I frowned, assuming it was a simple glitch with the magnetic strip. I rubbed the card against my jacket and tapped it again. Red light. Denial tone. My stomach gave a sudden, uncomfortable lurch. Before I could tap the card a third time, the heavy glass doors were pushed open from the inside. Standing there was the head of human resources, flanked by my managing director. Neither of them was smiling. Their faces were set in grim, unreadable expressions that immediately made the blood freeze in my veins. The managing director did not offer a polite greeting. He did not say congratulations on your graduation. He simply asked me to step into a private conference room immediately. There was a thick, suffocating tension in the air as I followed them down the hallway. The usual morning chatter of the trading floor seemed muted. I walked into the windowless conference room, and the heavy door clicked shut behind me, sealing us in. Sitting in the exact center of the large mahogany table was a single printed document bearing the official letterhead of the firm. I did not need to read the fine print to know what it was. The bold text at the top was unmistakable. It was a formal notice of indefinite suspension pending a high-level internal investigation. Winston was not bluffing, he had actually made the call. I slid into the driver's seat of my luxury sedan and let out a breath. I felt like I had been holding for 35 years. The adrenaline from the confrontation was still pumping fiercely through my veins, but my hands gripping the leather steering wheel were remarkably steady. Before I could even put the car into drive, my cell phone lit up the dark interior of the cabin. The caller identification flashed the name of my father. I should have ignored it, but I pressed the answer button and placed the device on the center console speaker. The voice of Winston was deathly quiet. It was completely stripped of all the screaming and bluster he had just displayed in the parking lot. He sounded calculating and entirely cold. He told me I had fundamentally misunderstood the power dynamics of the city we lived in. He asked if I remembered a man named Carlton Sterling. I absolutely did. Carlton was a senior board member at my wealth management firm, and more importantly, he was the longtime golf partner of my father at their exclusive Old Money Country Club. Winston explicitly outlined his retaliation plan right there on the phone. He told me that if I did not void the eviction notice and sign the house deed over to Connor by Monday morning, he was going to call Carlton. He promised to report me to the corporate board for unethical and predatory business practices. He said he would spin a story that I was illegally leveraging my financial expertise and insider knowledge to exploit and extort my own family members. He warned me that the entire financial sector relies on flawless trust and pristine reputation, and he was more than willing to destroy mine. He promised to permanently end the career I had just spent 5 grueling years shedding blood, sweat, and tears to build. I listened to his entire threat without interrupting him once. When he finally finished speaking, breathing heavily into the receiver, I just shook my head in the dark car. I told him he was bluffing. I reminded him of how deeply he cared about his flawless image in our prominent African-American church community. I told him he would never risk his own public reputation by admitting to his elite country club friends that his golden white son-in-law was a bankrupt failure, currently living in a foreclosed home. I told him he was far too obsessed with keeping up wealthy appearances to ever expose his own financial mess, just to spite his eldest daughter. I hung up the phone before he could formulate a response. I switched my device to Do Not Disturb, tossed it into the passenger seat, and drove out of the restaurant parking lot into the warm Atlanta night. Throughout the entire weekend, I enjoyed the profound and beautiful silence. I ordered expensive takeout from a local bistro, poured myself a generous glass of aged wine, and watched the city skyline from my penthouse balcony. I genuinely believed I had won the war. I thought the pride of my father was far too immense to ever let the corporate world know his family was anything less than picture perfect. I severely underestimated the depths of their vindictiveness. I did not realize that they would gladly burn their own house to the ground, as long as they could ensure I was trapped inside the flames. Monday morning arrived crisp and bright. I dressed in my sharpest tailored suit, feeling a renewed sense of purpose and absolute clarity. The toxicity was finally cut out of my life, and I was ready to step into my new chapter as a fully credentialed corporate executive. I walked into the soaring glass atrium of my financial firm holding my head high. I grabbed my usual morning coffee, greeted the security guards by name, and stepped into the elevator, riding it all the way up to the executive floor. I approached the heavy glass doors of my department, mentally preparing for my morning client meetings. I pulled my lanyard from my pocket and tapped my employee keycard against the security scanner mounted on the wall. The light blinked red. The scanner emitted a sharp, flat denial tone. I frowned, assuming it was a simple glitch with the magnetic strip. I rubbed the card against my jacket sleeve and tapped it again. Red light, denial tone. My stomach gave a sudden, uncomfortable lurch. Before I could tap the card a third time, the heavy glass doors were pushed open from the inside. Standing there was the head of human resources, flanked by my managing director. Neither of them was smiling. Their faces were set in grim, unreadable expressions that immediately made the blood freeze in my veins. The managing director did not offer a polite morning greeting. He did not say congratulations on your recent graduation. He simply looked at me with cold professional detachment and asked me to step into a private conference room immediately. There was a thick, suffocating tension in the air as I followed them down the carpeted hallway. The usual morning chatter of the trading floor seemed completely muted. I walked into the windowless conference room, and the heavy door clicked shut behind me, sealing us in. Sitting in the exact center of the large mahogany table was a single printed document bearing the official letterhead of the firm. I did not need to read the fine print to know what it was. The bold text at the top of the page was unmistakable. It was a formal notice of indefinite suspension pending a high-level internal investigation. Winston was not bluffing. My own father had actually made the call to ruin my life. I sat in the heavy leather chair opposite the head of human resources and my managing director staring at the crisp white paper resting on the mahogany table. The bold black letters spelling out indefinite suspension seemed to vibrate under the harsh fluorescent lights of the conference room. I did not reach out to touch the document immediately. I simply let my eyes scan the text, absorbing the sheer, breathtaking malice of what my family had just orchestrated to protect their fragile egos. The document outlined a highly detailed, thoroughly fabricated narrative. According to the formal complaint lodged directly with our corporate compliance office, I was being investigated for severe elder financial abuse. The complaint alleged that I had maliciously exploited my position as a licensed wealth manager to manipulate my aging parents into handing over family real estate assets. It did not stop there. Connor had clearly helped my father draft the complaint because the second paragraph contained a slew of regulatory buzzwords designed to trigger an immediate panic within the firm. They explicitly accused me of illegally commingling private client funds with my personal limited liability company to purchase distressed properties at public auction. They painted me as a predatory, unethical broker who used insider knowledge and corporate leverage to extort my own flesh and blood. "Claire, this is a highly sensitive situation," my managing director said, breaking the suffocating silence. His voice was heavy with a mix of disappointment and corporate caution. "You understand that in our industry, even the mere allegation of financial exploitation regarding a vulnerable family member is enough to trigger a mandatory reporting event to the regulatory boards." The head of human resources leaned forward, sliding a sleek silver pen across the polished wood table toward me. "We need you to sign this acknowledgement of your suspension. You are required to surrender your company phone, your laptop, and your client files immediately. You are not to contact any of your portfolio clients while the internal investigation is ongoing." I looked at the silver pen. Then I looked at the two executives sitting across from me. I knew exactly what they were waiting for. They were bracing themselves for an emotional explosion. They were waiting for me to raise my voice, to slam my hands on the table, to cry hot tears of injustice, and to beg them to believe my side of the story. They were waiting for the angry black woman stereotype to manifest right there in their conference room, a reaction that would instantly validate the unhinged predatory image my father had just painted of me. I denied them that satisfaction. As a dark-skinned African-American woman navigating the treacherous elite corridors of corporate wealth management, I learned a very long time ago that I did not have the luxury of losing my temper. My passion would always be labeled as aggression. My defense would always be labeled as insubordination. I had spent years building an impenetrable armor of professional poise, and I was not going to let Winston and Connor strip it away from me. I calmly folded my hands in my lap and met the gaze of my managing director with absolute freezing clarity. "I will not be signing that document today," I said, my voice perfectly modulated, smooth, and entirely devoid of panic. The head of human resources blinked, clearly thrown off guard by my icy composure. "Claire, refusing to sign the acknowledgement will not stop the suspension process. It is company policy." "I am fully aware of corporate policy," I replied, keeping my posture impeccably straight. "I am also aware of my legal rights. The allegations detailed in this complaint are entirely fabricated, completely baseless, and highly defamatory. I will surrender my company devices as requested, but I will not put my signature on any document without the presence and review of my retained legal counsel. I expect a certified copy of this complaint, including the exact transcripts of the phone call my father made to the board, to be sent to my lawyer by the end of the business day. My managing director shifted uncomfortably in his expensive chair. He was used to dealing with panicked employees, not someone treating their own suspension like a hostile corporate takeover. We will comply with your legal requests, Claire. But until the compliance team clears these allegations, you need to gather your personal items and vacate the premises. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my tailored blazer. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my company-issued phone, and placed it gently next to the unsigned suspension notice. I unclipped my security badge and laid it right beside the phone. I look forward to the rapid conclusion of this investigation, I said, maintaining direct, unwavering eye contact. Because when the compliance team reviews my personal financial records, they will find that every single dollar used in my private real estate transactions was clean post-tax income. Have a wonderful morning, gentlemen. I turned and walked out of the conference room. I did not rush. I did not look back. I walked down the long corridor toward my corner office with the deliberate, measured pace of a woman who owned the entire building. The trading floor was an open-concept design, meaning dozens of my colleagues, analysts, and junior associates were sitting at their desks as I approached my workspace. Whispers rippled through the aisles. People quickly averted their eyes, pretending to look at their monitors, but I could feel the heavy weight of their stares. They all knew what an unexpected mid-morning visit to the HR conference room meant. They were watching to see if I would crumble under the public humiliation. I kept my chin perfectly level. I picked up my designer handbag from under my desk, grabbed my personal car keys, and walked straight back toward the main glass doors. I smiled politely at the receptionist on my way out. I rode the elevator down to the parking garage in total silence, watching the digital floor numbers count down, holding my breath the entire way. When I finally reached my car, I unlocked the doors, slid into the driver's seat, and pulled the heavy door shut. The thick, soundproof insulation of the luxury cabin sealed me off from the rest of the world. For exactly 10 seconds, I let the professional mask slip. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned ashen, and I let out a sharp, ragged breath. My chest ached with the profound, staggering betrayal of it all. My own father had just attempted to destroy my entire livelihood, my reputation and my future, all to protect the bruised ego of his bankrupt white son-in-law. They wanted to break me. They wanted to leave me destitute so I would be forced to crawl back to them and beg for forgiveness. I released the steering wheel and took one deep, steadying breath, pulling the cold corporate armor right back into place. I reached into my purse and pulled out my personal encrypted cell phone. I did not call my mother to scream at her. I did not call my sister to curse her name. Playing emotional games with narcissists was a losing battle, and I was not playing games anymore. I was going to war. I scrolled through my contact list and pressed dial on the one person who had taught me exactly how to dismantle corporate enemies. Harrison was a senior partner at one of the most ruthless, high-powered corporate law firms in the Southeast. He was a brilliant, sharp-minded black man in his late 50s who had taken me under his wing when I first entered the financial sector. He had mentored me, taught me how to navigate the cutthroat politics of Atlanta elite business circles, and treated me with more paternal respect than Winston ever had in 35 years. The line rang twice before his deep, gravelly voice came through the speaker. Claire, Harrison said, sounding mildly surprised. You usually do not call me during market hours. Tell me you are calling to say you finally accepted that senior partner track. I stared out through the windshield into the dim concrete parking garage. I just got suspended, Harrison. I said, my voice cold and precise. My father and Connor just filed a fraudulent corporate complaint accusing me of elder financial abuse and embezzling client funds. They are trying to revoke my licenses and strip my career. There was a beat of silence on the other end of the line. When Harrison spoke again, all the casual warmth was completely gone from his voice. He shifted instantly into the legal shark that made Fortune 500 companies tremble. Where are you right now? He asked. I am sitting in the parking garage of my firm. I refused to sign their paperwork and invoked my right to counsel. Good girl, Harrison said smoothly. Do not say another word to anyone at that firm. Start your engine, drive straight to my office, and bring every single private financial record you have on that foreclosed property. We are going to bury them. Harrison slid his sleek silver laptop across the glass desk so the high-resolution screen faced me directly. I rested my hands on the cool glass, steadying myself before I typed in my credentials. As a licensed wealth manager, my credit score was my absolute lifeblood. I monitored my public financial footprint with meticulous, borderline obsessive precision. But Harrison had just instructed me to pull a comprehensive deep dive background credit report, the kind used for high-level federal clearances, pulling data from the deepest archives of all three major credit bureaus. I logged into the portal and hit submit. The loading circle spun on the screen for exactly 3 seconds. When the dashboard finally materialized, the crisp white background illuminated a financial nightmare that made the breath completely vanish from my lungs. I stared at the numbers, my mind struggling to process the impossible mathematics glaring back at me. My pristine credit history was stained with massive bleeding red derogatory marks. I clicked into the detailed breakdown and felt a cold, toxic dread wash over my entire body. There were 3 premium-tier credit lines, all completely maxed out to their absolute limits. Sitting right beneath them was a massive defaulted signature loan. I looked at the total outstanding balance. It was over $150,000 in unpaid neglected debt. None of these accounts belonged to me. I had never seen them before in my life. I had never received a single piece of mail, a single phone call, or a single alert regarding their existence. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, tracing my finger along the origination dates of the fraudulent accounts. Every single one of them had been opened exactly 5 years ago, right in the middle of September. I stared at that specific month and year, and the final devastating puzzle piece clicked into place. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was late summer 5 years ago. That was the exact same time frame Valerie and Winston were busy planning the social event of the decade. That was the month of Maya and Connor U.S. wedding. The memories of that lavish, absurdly extravagant weekend came rushing back to me in sickening detail. I remembered the exclusive country club venue that Winston had rented out. I remembered the imported floral arrangements cascading down the grand staircase, the live string quartet playing during the cocktail hour, and the custom designer gown Maya wore as she floated down the aisle toward her mediocre white husband. I remembered my mother Valerie, strutting around the reception hall in her custom silk dress, bragging loudly to the church pastors and the local politicians about how they had spared absolutely no expense for their golden daughter. They told everyone in our affluent African-American social circle that they paid for the entire wedding in cash straight from Winston U.S. Logistics Company. It was a complete and utter lie. There was no cash. There was no successful logistics company. There was only my stolen identity. They had funded my sister U.S. fairy tale wedding by financially bleeding me dry in the dark. My own parents had stolen my social security number, a number they had memorized since I was a child. They had forged my signature on digital banking applications. They had set up ghost email addresses to intercept the paperless billing statements so I would never be notified. They actively leveraged my impeccable hard-earned credit score to secure the capital they did not actually have, just to buy a temporary illusion of wealth. The profound depth of the betrayal anchored me to the heavy leather chair. This was not just standard parental favoritism. This was not just emotional neglect or passing remarks at a dinner table. This was a calculated, predatory, and devastating crime. My mother and father had actively victimized me. They sacrificed my financial future, my career stability, and my legal standing just to impress their country club friends and bankroll a lavish lifestyle for Maya and Connor. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew I was climbing the corporate ladder. They knew a default of this magnitude could eventually trigger a compliance audit and strip me of my licenses. They simply did not care. To my parents, I was never a daughter. I was nothing more than a disposable resource to be exploited. I looked up from the glowing laptop screen and met the eyes of my mentor. Harrison did not offer any empty, hollow words of comfort. He did not reach across the table to pat my hand or tell me that everything was going to be fine. He looked at the astronomical debt on the screen, looked at the origination dates, and leaned back in his chair. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his black coffee. His expression was dangerously calm, bearing the look of an apex predator who had just smelled blood in the water. "We are not just dealing with a standard corporate defamation suit anymore," Harrison said, his deep voice rumbling with absolute certainty. "This is felony identity theft. This is first-degree wire fraud. Your parents just handed us the exact ammunition we need to put them in federal prison. I sat there processing the sheer magnitude of the incoming war. A profound, icy resolve settled over my heart, freezing any lingering traces of familial loyalty. I was ready to authorize Harrison to draft the police reports right then and there. I was ready to watch the authorities place Valerie and Winston in handcuffs. But before I could even open my mouth to speak, a sharp metallic ping echoed through the quiet office. The notification sound came from Harrison U.S. desktop computer. Because he was a brilliantly paranoid attorney, he had set up a comprehensive legal alert system on my private limited liability company the moment I sat down in his office. The system was designed to instantly track any and all municipal activity regarding the deed to the foreclosed house currently occupied by Maya and Connor. Harrison set down his coffee mug and clicked the notification. His dark eyes scanned the incoming email from the county clerk U.S. office. A sharp, humorless laugh escaped his chest. He turned his large monitor around so it faced me directly. Connor was apparently in a blind, desperate panic about the 30-day eviction notice I had dropped on his dinner plate. Instead of packing his bags and looking for a cheap apartment, the man had actually doubled down on his own arrogant stupidity. The digital notification clearly showed that Connor had just attempted to file a quitclaim deed with the county courthouse. I was trying to illegally and forcefully transfer the ownership of my $500,000 property directly into his own name to block the eviction process. And resting right at the bottom of the scanned digital filing plain as day was my blatantly forged signature. Harrison and I stared at the digital signature glowing on his computer monitor. Connor had actually done it. In a desperate and panicked attempt to stop a perfectly legal 30-day eviction, a mediocre white man with absolutely zero financial literacy had committed a major felony right in broad daylight. He had downloaded a generic quitclaim deed template from the internet, filled in the legal information for my private limited liability company, and slapped a horrific, clumsy imitation of my signature right on the bottom line. It was so insulting, so spectacularly arrogant, that I did not even feel anger anymore. I just felt a deep, chilling sense of anticipation. Harrison locked his eyes on the screen and let out a low, rumbling laugh. He looked at me and told me that when your enemy is actively drowning, you do not throw them an anvil. You just sit back on the shoreline and watch them drink the water. We already had my parents dead to rights on identity theft and massive wire fraud. Now we had Connor cornered on felony forgery. But we were not going to strike yet. We were going to let them get completely comfortable. By Wednesday afternoon, the internal compliance team at my wealth management firm called me back into the executive conference room. The atmosphere was completely different this time. The managing director looked deeply apologetic, almost embarrassed to be sitting across from me. My financial paper trail was absolutely flawless. I had handed their auditors perfectly documented tax returns, official business registration papers, and legally binding auction receipts. There was absolutely no elder abuse, no commingled client funds, and zero predatory practices. The corporate board saw the complaint filed by my father for exactly what it was. It was a malicious, fabricated lie designed to extort me. They formally lifted my suspension right there on the spot. They apologized profusely for the inconvenience and immediately offered to fast-track my senior partner review to avoid any potential discrimination lawsuits. I accepted their apology with polite professional grace, but I made one very specific request. I asked the managing director to keep my full reinstatement entirely confidential for the next few weeks. I wanted my active corporate status hidden from any external inquiries. I needed my father, my mother, and my sister to genuinely believe they had won the war. I needed them to think I was sitting alone in my luxury penthouse, recently fired, completely broke and drowning in absolute despair. I went completely off the grid. I did not block the phone numbers of my family members. I simply left their text threads on read. I wanted them to see that I was receiving their messages, but lacked the courage or the power to respond to them. Valerie sent me dozens of messages over the next few days. Her texts were a masterclass in narcissistic gloating, disguised as maternal concern. She texted me saying she heard about my unfortunate little corporate problem at work. She suggested I humble myself, come back to her house, and apologize to the entire family for my behavior. She said she was praying daily for my bitter heart. She told me that God was actively punishing me for disrespecting my father and trying to ruin the marriage of my sister. I read every single word she typed while sipping a hot espresso at my desk in my corner office, entirely unbothered by her delusions. Then came Maya. My younger sister had always weaponized social media to validate her existence, but her recent posts reached an entirely new level of staggering delusion. Since she genuinely believed Connor had successfully transferred the deed to the house and that my career was permanently ruined, she felt utterly invincible. I sat at my desk during my lunch break and watched her latest Instagram reel. It was a highly produced, beautifully edited video of her giving her thousands of followers a guided tour of the very house I was actively evicting her from. Maya was walking through the grand foyer, holding a designer coffee cup, talking directly to the camera, with that soft, performative voice she always used to impress her elite church friends. She talked at length about how this new season of her life was all about divine abundance and protecting her peace. She actually had the audacity to look straight into the camera lens and say that God had recently removed a massive source of toxic, jealous energy from her inner circle. She claimed this spiritual cleansing had finally cleared the way for her and Connor to step into their true generational wealth. The comment section under the video was an absolute joke. Her followers were praising her resilience and her beautiful home. Connor was actively replying to comments, soaking up compliments about his incredible business acumen, acting like he was some brilliant tech visionary instead of a bankrupt felon currently facing serious prison time. But manipulating social media was not enough for Valerie. My mother needed a physical, tangible audience to witness her supposed triumph over me. With my career seemingly destroyed and the suburban house supposedly secured under the forged deed Connor filed, Valerie felt an overwhelming need to take a massive victory lap. She decided that this was the absolute perfect moment to organize a ridiculously lavish, no-expense-spared 40th anniversary gala for herself and Winston. She wanted to prove to the entire Atlanta elite that her family was the absolute pinnacle of Black excellence. She wanted the politicians, the mega-church pastors, and the country club executives to look at her and see flawless, untouchable success. She began booking the grand ballroom at one of the most exclusive luxury hotels downtown. She was ordering massive displays of imported flowers, hiring a 12-piece live band, and sending out heavy gold-foiled invitations to hundreds of people in our social circle. She was spending tens of thousands of dollars. She did not actually have blindly setting up the absolute perfect stage for her own spectacular destruction. While my mother was busy agonizing over imported floral centerpieces and champagne fountains, Harrison and I were sitting in his mahogany-paneled office, quietly finalizing the legal trap that would close around them. We did not send a cease and desist letter regarding the forged quitclaim deed. We did not issue a polite corporate warning or a demand for mediation. Harrison looked at me across his massive desk and told me that when people show you they are willing to commit federal crimes to maintain their lifestyle, you do not argue with them. You simply let the criminal justice system do the talking. We gathered every single piece of financial evidence we had accumulated. We printed the time-stamped origination documents for the 3 maxed-out credit lines Valerie had fraudulently opened in my name. We pulled the detailed statements for the defaulted signature loan she used to pay for the lavish country club wedding of my sister. We downloaded the digital tracking data from the county clerk office, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that Connor had actively submitted a fraudulent property transfer using a terribly forged version of my signature. We compiled bank statements, internet protocol address logs, and property tax records. We bound it all into a single, perfectly indexed 200-page binder. Harrison made a direct phone call to an old colleague of his who worked as a senior prosecutor in the fraud division of the district attorney office. We walked into the county courthouse 2 days later through a private back entrance. We sat down in a stark, fluorescent-lit room with 3 financial crimes detectives. I handed over the thick binder. I answered their questions with complete emotionless precision. The detectives looked at the undeniable depth of the identity theft and the brazen stupidity of the forged real estate document, and they did not hesitate for a single second. The lead detective assured Harrison that they were fast-tracking the arrest warrants. The heavy wheels of the justice system had officially begun to turn, and my family remained completely oblivious, entirely focused on preparing for their upcoming social event. Simultaneously, we expedited the 30-day eviction notice. Because Connor had attempted to file a fraudulent quitclaim deed to block the legal process, Harrison was able to petition the housing court for an emergency ruling. The judge reviewed the forgery evidence and granted an immediate writ of possession. The county sheriff was officially scheduled to execute the lockout at the stroke of midnight on the exact weekend of my parents' anniversary gala. The timing was so perfectly, poetically flawless that I could not have orchestrated it better if I had tried. I was going to let them dance the night away right up until the exact moment the heavy hand of reality crashed through their front door. A week before the grand event, I stepped off the private elevator into the lobby of my penthouse building to check my mail. My concierge smiled and handed me a thick, heavy envelope. It was made of premium textured ivory cardstock, completely covered in ornate gold-foiled calligraphy. I recognized the expensive stationery immediately. It was the exact same luxury brand my mother had used for the wedding invitations of my sister 5 years ago, the very same invitations I had unknowingly paid for with my stolen identity. I carried the heavy envelope upstairs, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and broke the gold wax seal at my kitchen island. Inside was a ridiculously elaborate invitation, cordially requesting my presence at a black tie gala, celebrating the 40th wedding anniversary of Winston and Valerie. The sheer narcissism required to invite the daughter you just publicly disowned, the daughter whose career you just tried to destroy, simply to rub your supposed victory in her face, was absolutely staggering. But what truly caught my attention was not the gold foil or the pretentious wording. Stuck right over the elegant response card was a bright yellow sticky note. The handwriting belonged to my younger sister. Maya had taken a thick black marker and scrawled a deeply petty childish message directly onto the expensive paper. It read, "In case you need a free meal now that you are jobless." I stared at that bright yellow sticky note for a very long time. I did not feel the familiar sting of rejection. I did not feel the heavy, suffocating weight of being the family scapegoat. I felt a sharp, brilliant surge of pure exhilaration. Maya and Valerie genuinely believed they had broken me. They thought I was sitting in my apartment destitute, stripped of my corporate licenses, and crying over my ruined life. They wanted me to show up to their extravagant party looking defeated and broken so they could parade their fake wealth in front of me and solidify their elevated status in the Atlanta high society scene. I peeled the yellow sticky note off the card and placed it gently on my marble countertop. I took a sleek black pen and checked the box marked "Joyfully Accepts" on the response card. I wrote down that I would be bringing a +1, sealed the card in the return envelope, and left it by the door to be mailed. I picked up my phone and dialed the number of my best friend. Kendra had been my absolute rock since our undergraduate days at Spelman College. She was a brilliant, sharp-witted corporate public relations strategist who knew exactly how toxic my family had always been. She answered on the second ring with her usual vibrant energy. "Clear your schedule for next Saturday night," I told her, my voice buzzing with electric anticipation. "We are going to a massive anniversary gala at the Four Seasons Hotel." Kendra paused on the other end of the line. She knew exactly whose anniversary was coming up. "Are you absolutely out of your mind?" she asked, her voice raising in disbelief. "Why on earth would you walk back into the lion den after those people just tried to end your career and steal your property?" "Because they think they killed the lion," I replied smoothly. "And they are about to throw a massive party to celebrate my demise. I need you to go to Phipps Plaza today. Buy the most stunning, show-stopping, unapologetically expensive evening gown you can find. I am wearing my emerald silk dress. We are going to walk into that grand ballroom looking like absolute royalty." Kendra let out a low, melodic laugh that told me she completely understood the assignment. She lived for moments of poetic justice, just as much as I did. "What exactly are we celebrating, Claire?" she asked, her tone shifting from concern to pure excitement. "We are celebrating the end of an era," I said. "We are celebrating the exposure of a fraud." I hung up the phone and walked into my home office. I pulled my heavy designer leather briefcase from the top shelf of my bookcase. I did not pack it with business contracts or daily client portfolios. I packed it with high-resolution legally certified copies of the finalized eviction notice. I packed it with the official bankruptcy filings of my father. I packed it with the signed police reports detailing the massive identity theft and the felony forgery committed by Connor. I snapped the golden brass locks of the briefcase shut, sealing the absolute destruction of their fake empire inside. I was ready. The drive to the Four Seasons Hotel in downtown Atlanta was the most peaceful car ride of my entire life. I sat in the plush leather back seat of Harrison U.S. chauffeured vehicle, watching the city lights blur past the tinted windows. I wore a custom emerald silk gown that cascaded perfectly to the floor paired with minimal gold jewelry. I did not want to look flashy. I wanted to look expensive, untouchable, and completely unbothered. Kendra sat beside me in a stunning sapphire dress, radiating the kind of fierce protective energy only a best friend of 15 years can provide. Harrison sat across from us in a bespoke charcoal tuxedo, looking exactly like the ruthless legal shark he was. Resting on the seat between us was my heavy leather briefcase. It was the only accessory I truly needed tonight. When the chauffeur pulled up to the grand entrance of the hotel, the valets immediately rushed forward to open our doors. We stepped out into the humid evening air and walked into the sprawling marble-floored lobby. We bypassed the standard elevator banks and took the grand sweeping staircase up to the main ballroom level. I could hear the music echoing down the corridor before we even reached the doors. It was a live 12-piece jazz band playing smooth, sophisticated covers of classic rhythm and blues hits. As we approached the entrance, I handed my name to the immaculately dressed hostess managing the guest list. She ran her finger down the heavy cardstock, found my name, and blinked in surprise. She clearly knew who I was, and she clearly knew the rumors my family had been spreading about my supposed downfall. She looked at my flawless gown, looked at the two incredibly powerful people flanking me, and offered a cautious, highly respectful smile. She pushed open the heavy mahogany doors, and we stepped inside. It was an absolute masterclass in financial delusion. Valerie had spared absolutely zero expense to prove her non-existent wealth to the city. The massive ballroom was draped in floor-to-ceiling white silk. There were towering 6-foot-tall floral arrangements of imported white orchids on every single table. A massive cascading champagne fountain anchored the center of the room. Photographers roamed the floor snapping pictures of the guests. The room was packed with exactly the kind of people my parents worshipped. There were prominent politicians, wealthy local real estate developers, and the senior pastors from all the most elite megachurches in Atlanta. It was a carefully curated audience of high society African American families, the kind of people who valued prestige, perfect public images, and generational legacy above absolutely everything else. These were the people Valerie and Winston had spent their entire lives trying to impress. We did not skulk into the room or hide in the back. I walked directly into the center of the ballroom, holding my head perfectly high. The dynamic shift in the room was almost instantaneous. When three highly confident, impeccably dressed people walk into an event with absolute purpose, the air pressure changes. Guests sitting at the outer tables stopped their conversations and turned to look. People who recognized me from church or past family events did visible double takes. According to the narrative Valerie had been aggressively peddling all week, I was supposed to be unemployed under federal investigation, drowning in depression, and hiding in shame. I was supposed to be the tragic, unstable daughter who ruined her own life out of jealousy. Instead, I looked like I owned the entire hotel. I scanned the sprawling room and finally spotted them. They were sitting at an elevated head table positioned perfectly to overlook their guests. Valerie was holding court. She had a crystal glass of champagne in her hand, her head thrown back in a joyous, ringing laugh as she entertained a group of wealthy deacons from their church. She wore a glittering silver gown that undoubtedly cost thousands of dollars she did not actually possess. Maya and Connor sat right next to her, holding hands and acting like the perfect wealthy heirs to the family empire. I stopped walking. I stood perfectly still in the middle of the ballroom and simply waited. It took exactly 20 seconds. Valerie turned her head to place her champagne glass on the table, and her eyes swept across the crowd. Her gaze locked directly onto mine across the sea of crystal chandeliers and white orchids. It was deeply cinematic, the smug, radiant, triumphant joy completely evaporated from her face in a fraction of a second. Her jaw actually went slack. The glass in her hand tilted dangerously, almost spilling champagne onto her expensive silver dress. I watched the sheer visceral shock hit her system. She looked at my posture. She looked at the expensive silk of my dress. She looked at the heavy leather briefcase hanging from my hand. I was not broken, I was not crying, I was armed. The psychological breakdown on her face was exquisite. Valerie immediately dropped her glass on the table and grabbed the arm of her son-in-law. Connor looked up annoyed by the sudden grip and followed her gaze across the room. When he saw me standing there with Harrison, the color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a panicked ghost. He knew exactly who Harrison was. I knew that I had walked into this room with one of the most terrifying corporate attorneys in the state. Valerie went into immediate damage control mode. She completely abandoned her elegant high society persona and started frantically looking around the perimeter of the ballroom. I watched as she locked eyes with a large, broad-shouldered man in a dark suit, wearing a security earpiece. She waved him over aggressively, completely ignoring the confused looks of the church deacons sitting at her table. She leaned in and whispered frantically to the security guard, pointing a sharp, manicured finger discreetly in my direction. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was spinning a rapid, desperate lie. She was telling him that her unhinged, jobless, estranged daughter had crashed the private anniversary gala and needed to be escorted out through the back service elevators immediately before she caused a violent scene. She wanted me silenced and removed before I could ruin her perfect night. The security guard nodded seriously, tapping his earpiece to signal for backup. He began to navigate his way through the crowded tables, moving with a fast, heavy purpose directly toward where Kendra Harrison and I were standing. Harrison noticed the guard approaching. He did not flinch. He simply took one deliberate step forward, positioning his broad shoulders slightly in front of me. It was a silent, unmistakable warning to the hotel security staff. Harrison was daring that guard to put a single hand on his client. But before the security guard could close the remaining distance between us, the ambient lights in the grand ballroom suddenly dimmed. A hush fell over the crowd as the jazz band stopped playing. A bright, focused spotlight hit the main acrylic podium on the center stage. My father Winston stepped up to the microphone. He adjusted the lapels of his custom tuxedo, flashing a blinding, charismatic smile at the hundreds of wealthy guests staring up at him. He looked like the absolute pinnacle of patriarchal success. He tapped the microphone twice, the sharp sound echoing through the massive room, demanding total silence and absolute attention. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Winston began, his booming, authoritative voice wrapping around the crowd. 40 years. 40 years of marriage of faith, and of building a foundation that will stand the test of time. I stared up at the stage, feeling my pulse slow down to a steady, rhythmic beat. The hypocrisy pouring out of his mouth was so thick it was almost suffocating. When Valerie and I started out, we had nothing but a vision and our trust in the Lord. Winston continued spreading his hands wide to embrace the audience. We knew that success is not just about the money you make. It is about the legacy you leave behind. It is about building true generational wealth, maintaining unbreakable family values, and setting an example of integrity for our children to inherit. He actually had the audacity to say the word integrity into a microphone while standing in a room paid for by my stolen identity. He was lecturing a room full of pastors and business elites about generational wealth, while his own logistics company was completely bankrupt and his son-in-law was facing felony forgery charges. The crowd erupted into polite, reverent applause. People were nodding their heads, taking sips of their champagne, completely buying into the fraudulent narrative of the perfect, faithful, affluent black family. I looked at Kendra. She gave me a single slow nod, her eyes shining with anticipation. I looked at Harrison. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, cleared his throat, and gave me a faint, approving smile. I looked down at the heavy leather briefcase in my hand. I unclasped the twin golden brass locks. The sharp metallic clicks were drowned out by the applause of the crowd, but to me they were the loudest sounds in the entire room. I did not wait for the security guard to reach me. I did not wait for Winston to finish his grand speech. I gripped the handle of my briefcase, stepped around Harrison, and began my long, deliberate walk directly toward the center stage. It was time to introduce Atlanta to the real Winston and Valerie. The heavy security guard lunged toward me, his large hand reaching out to grab my arm and drag me out of the ballroom. He never even made contact. Harrison stepped effortlessly into his path, blocking the guard with nothing but his imposing height and a freezing authoritative glare that practically screamed a multi-million-dollar corporate lawsuit. The guard hesitated for just a fraction of a second, and that was all the time I needed. I glided past them both, lifting the hem of my emerald silk gown as I confidently ascended the 3 short steps onto the center stage. Winston was mid-sentence, his deep baritone voice still echoing through the ballroom speakers, talking about the grace of God and the value of hard work. When he registered my presence standing right beside him in the blinding spotlight, the words died in his throat. His jaw snapped shut. The professional, charismatic smile dropped from his face, replaced by naked, unadulterated terror. He gripped the edges of the clear acrylic podium, his knuckles turning white. Before he could recover his wits or signal for help, I reached out and gently but firmly took the wireless microphone right out of his hand. He was too stunned to resist. I turned to face the sea of guests. Hundreds of eyes were locked on me. I did not scowl. I did not raise my voice. I channeled every single ounce of professional executive poise I had perfected over the last decade. I looked out at the prominent pastors, the elite politicians, and the wealthy business developers of Atlanta, and I offered them a warm, brilliant smile. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the massive room. "For those of you who might not know me, my name is Claire. I am the eldest daughter of Winston and Valerie. I know I am not on the official program tonight, but considering the theme of this beautiful evening is generational wealth and family legacy, I simply could not sit by without saying a few words to honor my parents." The heavy tension in the room instantly diffused. The guests smiled, completely unaware of the looming destruction. They assumed this was a beautiful, unplanned tribute from a loving, successful daughter. I heard a few polite claps ripple through the crowd. Down at the head table, Valerie looked like she might actually pass out. She was gripping the edge of her table so hard her arms were shaking. Maya and Connor sat entirely petrified, their eyes wide with panic. My father was just up here talking about the foundation he and my mother built over the last 40 years. I continued, pacing slowly across the stage, owning the space entirely. They have spent their entire lives cultivating an image of flawless success. They have taught my sister and me that in our community, excellence is not just encouraged, it is required. They have shown us the true cost of maintaining a luxury lifestyle, the deep sacrifices that must be made to ensure the world looks at our family and sees nothing but pure, untouchable Black excellence. I let a soft round of applause roll through the audience for a moment. Then my smile faded, just a fraction, shifting into something dangerously sharp. I locked eyes with my mother. "But the thing about generational wealth," I said, my tone dropping an octave, becoming crisp and highly clinical, "is that it requires absolute transparency to survive. It requires actual capital, not just the illusion of it. You cannot build a legacy on stolen foundations, and you certainly cannot fund it by sacrificing your own children to keep up appearances." The ballroom went deathly quiet. The polite smiles vanished from the faces of the pastors and the politicians. People leaned forward in their seats, sensing the sudden drastic shift in the atmosphere. The air felt heavy, charged with electricity. Winston finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. He lunged toward me, whispering frantically off microphone for me to shut my mouth and get off his stage. I expertly stepped out of his reach, turning my body so he was forced to stop or risk tackling me in front of hundreds of his peers. I looked past the sea of tables, past the towering white orchid centerpieces, straight toward the audio-visual booth at the far back of the room. Kendra was standing right there, holding my encrypted cell phone in her hand. She met my gaze across the distance. I gave her one single definitive nod. Kendra plugged the connection cable directly into the main projector system of the hotel. The smooth jazz background music cut off with a harsh static pop. The house lights dimmed entirely. the three massive presentation screens hanging behind the stage, which were previously displaying an elegant golden monogram of my parents' names, suddenly flickered to life. The trap was officially sprung. The digital projectors hummed as they synced with my phone. The massive screens hanging above the stage, which had just displayed an elegant golden monogram of my parents' names, suddenly flashed bright white. High-resolution legal documents appeared in glaring black and white text. The stark contrast against the opulent white silk draping of the ballroom was incredibly jarring. Winston turned around, squinting against the bright glare of the projector. I watched his eyes track the bold text at the very top of the first document. He physically stumbled backward, his shoulder bumping hard into the clear acrylic podium. I raised the microphone to my lips. My voice echoed through the silent ballroom, crisp, corporate, and completely devoid of mercy. To truly understand generational wealth, I said, making direct eye contact with the high-profile investors sitting in the front row, we must first examine our actual assets. Let us look at the primary residence of Maya and Connor. This is the luxury estate my mother proudly boasts about at church every single Sunday. The first document on the screen was the finalized court-ordered eviction notice. The official seal of the county judge was stamped clearly in the bottom corner for everyone to see. I narrated the document for the captive audience. I explained that Connor had defaulted on his heavily leveraged mortgage 2 years ago. I detailed how I used my private limited liability company to purchase their debt at a public auction to save them from immediate homelessness. I let the crowd read the final line of the court order stating that Maya and Connor had exactly 0 legal rights to the property. I announced that they were officially scheduled to be forcefully locked out by the county sheriff at midnight tonight. A collective audible gasp rippled through the ballroom. I looked down at the head table. Maya had her hands clamped over her mouth, heavy tears ruining her expensive makeup. Connor was staring down at his plate, his face entirely paralyzed with shame. But true wealth is about more than just residential real estate. I continued, my voice steady and unyielding. It is about business acumen. It is about the powerful corporate legacy of my father. I signaled Kendra at the back of the room. She tapped the screen of my phone. The massive projectors flashed, transitioning instantly to the second set of documents. These were the active Chapter 11 bankruptcy filings for the logistics company owned by Winston. The pages detailed massive catastrophic debt, hundreds of unpaid vendor invoices, and severe default notices from 3 major financial institutions. Winston grabbed my arm, his fingers digging painfully into my skin. He was trembling violently. "Claire, stop this right now," he hissed off microphone, his voice cracking with panic. "You are destroying everything we built." I easily pulled my arm away from his grasp. "You destroyed yourself, Winston. I am simply giving your investors their quarterly update." I looked down at the wealthy men sitting at the VIP tables in the front row. These were the prominent businessmen Winston had invited specifically to secure future funding for his failing company. They looked absolutely horrified. One of them actually pulled out his cell phone right there at the table, frantically texting his legal team to pull whatever capital they had tied up in my father's U.S. fraudulent enterprise. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, transforming rapidly into a chaotic buzz of shock and outrage. The elite status-obsessed society of Atlanta was watching their most prized members get slaughtered in real time. Valerie stood up from the head table. She was shaking with a rage so profound she could barely keep her balance. She pointed at me, her voice cutting sharply through the noise of the crowded ballroom. "She is lying," Valerie screamed. "This is a fabricated attack by a jealous, bitter woman. She is trying to humiliate us because she is a miserable failure. Do not look at those screens." I looked down at my mother. The sheer delusion required to maintain her lies in the face of absolute projected proof was staggering. She was clinging to her fake social status like a drowning woman clutching a piece of driftwood. "I have one final asset to share," I said into the microphone, my tone dropping to a chilling calm. "It highlights the profound faith and family values my mother just spoke of so highly." Kendra clicked the final slide. The screens filled with official police reports from the fraud division of the district attorney office. The badge of the local police department was visible on the header. I read the criminal charges out loud, so the people sitting in the very back of the room could hear them perfectly. I detailed how Valerie had actively stolen my identity, opened 3 premium credit lines, and defaulted on a massive signature loan just to fund the extravagant country club wedding of Maya. I explained how my own parents purposely bled my financial future dry to buy a temporary illusion of wealth to impress their friends. Then I moved to the second police report. I explained how Connor, in a desperate last-minute bid to stop his legal eviction, had committed felony forgery. He had submitted a fake quitclaim deed to the county clerk office, complete with a horribly falsified version of my signature, attempting to steal my property outright. The ballroom descended into pure, unadulterated chaos. Prominent pastors were shaking their heads in absolute disgust. Wealthy socialites were whispering frantically to each other behind their hands. The flawless, untouchable facade of my family had disintegrated completely. They were entirely exposed to their entire community as thieves, frauds, and predators. Valerie collapsed back into her chair, covering her face to hide her shame. Maya was sobbing uncontrollably, her tears dropping onto her expensive silk dress. Connor looked like he was about to be physically sick right onto the imported white orchid centerpieces. Winston stood completely frozen on the stage beside me, his entire world burned to absolute ashes. I lowered the microphone and set it gently on the acrylic podium. The execution was flawless. I had taken back my power, my narrative, and my peace. Then the heavy double doors at the very back of the grand ballroom swung open with a resounding, violent crash. The sharp flashing red and blue lights of multiple police cruisers reflected against the large venue windows, piercing through the dark night outside. The wailing sound of heavy sirens echoed loudly from the street below, cutting through the noise of the panicked guests. 6 uniformed police officers and 2 plainclothes fraud detectives strode directly into the opulent ballroom. They did not pause to admire the white silk drapery or the towering champagne fountain. They walked with absolute uncompromising purpose down the center aisle, marching straight past the horrified guests and making a direct, unavoidable beeline straight for Connor. The lead fraud detective did not lower his voice to preserve the dignity of the event. He stopped right in front of the head table and stated loud and clear that Connor was being placed under immediate arrest for felony forgery and real estate fraud. Connor stood up from his chair, his hands raised in front of him. He immediately tried to use the one thing that had always protected him in the past. He straightened his posture, puffed out his chest, and tried to leverage his white privilege to talk his way out of a federal crime in a room full of affluent black professionals. He put on his best, most patronizing corporate voice. He told the detectives that there had simply been a minor clerical error with a property transfer. He told them he knew the district attorney personally, and that putting a prominent business owner in handcuffs at a private family gala was a massive overreaction. The detectives did not care about his supposed connections. They did not care about his tailored blazer or his arrogant tone. One of the officers grabbed his arm, spun him around forcefully, and clamped the heavy metal handcuffs around his wrists, right next to a towering display of imported shrimp and caviar. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking into place echoed perfectly over the stunned silence of the ballroom. Maya completely lost her mind. The illusion of her flawless, wealthy life was being shattered in real time, and she could not handle the reality of it. She threw herself toward the officers, grabbing frantically at their dark uniforms. She screamed hysterically that her husband was an innocent tech visionary, that I had set them up, and that they were making a terrible mistake. One of the uniformed officers pointed a stern finger at her and warned her to step back immediately, or she would be arrested for interfering with an active police investigation. Maya collapsed onto the polished marble floor. Her expensive silk gown pooled around her as she sobbed uncontrollably, smearing her flawless makeup across her face. I looked out into the crowd and saw several of her elite church friends pulling out their cell phones, quietly recording her public meltdown to share in their group chats later. Winston finally found his footing and stepped down from the center stage. His face was slick with a heavy, panicked sweat. He completely bypassed his sobbing daughter and his arrested son-in-law. He walked straight toward the VIP tables in the front row, desperate to salvage his only remaining financial lifeline. He approached the 3 primary investors he had spent months aggressively courting. He held out his hands, offering a shaky, desperate smile. He promised them that the bankruptcy documents glowing on the projector screens above were just a minor restructuring issue, and that his logistics company was perfectly sound. The investors were not fools. They were seasoned, ruthless businessmen who recognized a sinking ship the second it started taking on water. The senior investor stood up from the table and slowly buttoned his suit jacket. He looked at my father with a level of absolute disgust that made my chest swell with validation. He told Winston that he was a manipulative con artist. He stated clearly in front of the surrounding tables that every single dollar of capital they had previously committed was officially withdrawn, effective immediately. He promised my father that by Monday morning, nobody in the entire Atlanta business sector would ever take a phone call from him again. Winston was left standing entirely alone in the center of the ballroom, his hands grasping at empty air, watching his entire corporate legacy evaporate into dust. Across the room, Valerie was attempting her own desperate, frantic damage control. She rushed toward the cluster of tables occupied by the senior pastors and the elite women of our megachurch. These were the women she had spent decades gossiping with the women. She constantly tried to outshine with her luxury cars, her expensive hats, and her performative charity donations. She reached out to grab the hand of the head pastor, us wife, real tears streaming down her face. She tried to play the ultimate helpless victim. She claimed that I was experiencing a severe mental breakdown. She told the churchwomen that I was filled with a toxic demonic jealousy, that I had fabricated the identity theft out of pure spite, and that the police had made a terrible mistake. But high society operates on a very strict set of unspoken rules. You can be cruel, you can be arrogant, and you can be a terrible mother, but you absolutely cannot be publicly exposed as a financial fraud. The pastor's wife pulled her hand away from Valerie as if my mother was carrying a highly contagious disease. She gave Valerie a cold, pitying look that stripped away every ounce of my mother-us remaining dignity. "We will pray for your family," Valerie the pastor's wife said quietly. Then she picked up her designer clutch and turned her back completely. The other church members at the table immediately followed suit. One by one they stood up, gathered their belongings, and walked away. They created a wide, obvious circle of isolation around my mother. Her social exile was immediate, absolute, and completely brutal. She was left standing by herself in her glittering silver gown, entirely abandoned by the community she had sacrificed my financial future to impress. I stood on the stage and watched their fake empire burn to the ground. I did not feel the need to walk over and gloat. I did not need to scream or point fingers or twist the knife any further. They had built a fragile house of cards out of lies and stolen money, and I had simply opened the window and let the wind blow through. I stepped down from the stage, the heavy emerald silk of my gown gliding smoothly over the stairs. Harrison and Kendra were waiting for me exactly where I had left them. Kendra had a fierce, deeply satisfied smile on her face. Harrison offered his arm to me with a look of profound professional respect. I took his arm, holding my heavy leather briefcase firmly in my other hand. We did not look back at the wreckage. We walked straight down the center aisle of the ballroom, parting the crowd of stunned, silent guests with our presence. We walked out the heavy mahogany doors, leaving the flashing police lights, the screaming sister, and the burning bridge completely behind us. The dust had finally settled over the city of Atlanta. 2 weeks had passed since the spectacular public destruction of the fake empire my family had built. I was sitting at the massive marble island in my high-security luxury penthouse, holding a warm cup of imported dark roast coffee. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a completely unobstructed, breathtaking view of the downtown skyline, bathed in the soft golden light of Sunday morning. My peace was absolute and entirely uninterrupted. My career was not just intact, it was booming. The corporate board at my wealth management firm had been so horrified by the false allegations and so deeply impressed by my ruthless, calculated handling of the situation that they fast-tracked my promotion. I was officially a senior partner, occupying the largest corner office on the executive floor. Over the past 14 days, I had watched the complete collapse of my family from a safe, comfortable distance. Connor was currently sitting in a county jail cell wearing a standard-issue jumpsuit. Because Winston was completely bankrupt and Valerie had zero access to credit, nobody could post his exorbitant bail. The fraud detectives had uncovered even more financial irregularities in his failed startup, ensuring he would not be seeing the outside world anytime soon. Winston was forced to file for total liquidation of his logistics company. His highly prized country club membership was permanently revoked. The elite Black Society of Atlanta had excommunicated my parents with a swiftness that was almost terrifying to witness. And the eviction notice I had dropped on the table at my graduation dinner had been executed flawlessly. The county sheriff had arrived at the suburban estate right on schedule, forcing Maya and my parents to vacate the premises immediately. The soft, melodic chime of the private intercom system echoed through my quiet penthouse. It was the concierge from the main lobby downstairs. I pressed the communication button expecting a routine notification about a grocery delivery or a floral arrangement from a client. Instead, the voice of the head of security came through the speaker. He sounded highly uncomfortable, lowering his voice as if he was trying to prevent a chaotic public scene. He told me that there were 3 individuals in the lobby aggressively demanding to see me. He said they bypassed the outer security gate by following a delivery truck inside, and now they were refusing to leave the reception area. He read the names from the identification cards they had forcefully shoved onto his pristine desk: Winston, Valerie, and Maya. The security chief asked if I wanted him to call the local police department and have them physically escorted off the property for trespassing. I stood completely still in my kitchen, the warm coffee mug resting in my hands. The irony of the situation was almost too poetic to comprehend. 2 weeks ago, my mother had desperately signaled security at a luxury hotel, trying to have me thrown out of her anniversary gala like a piece of worthless garbage. Now she was the one standing in a lobby facing the very real threat of being dragged out into the street by the authorities. I told the security chief to hold off on calling the police. I wanted to see this for myself. I set my coffee mug down on the marble counter. I walked into my expansive closet and selected my clothing with absolute deliberate intention. I did not throw on a pair of casual sweatpants or a faded shirt. I put on a set of pristine cream-colored silk loungewear. I slipped my feet into a pair of designer leather loafers. I checked my reflection in the mirror, making sure my posture was flawless, and my expression was completely unreadable. I looked exactly like the woman who owned her entire world. I stepped out of my apartment and walked into the private elevator reserved exclusively for penthouse residents. I pressed the button for the ground floor. As the heavy steel doors slid shut and the elevator began its rapid descent, I felt a strange, chilling sense of anticipation. I was not afraid. I was not anxious. I was simply ready to close the final chapter on the most toxic era of my life. For 35 years, they had treated me like a secondary character in my own existence. They had called me a bitter, jealous, angry woman, simply because I refused to fund their delusions. Now the heavy metal box was carrying me down to face the exact people who had wished I was never born. The elevator doors chimed and slid open to reveal the sprawling, immaculately designed lobby of my building. The space was an architectural masterpiece of polished granite modern art installations and towering indoor palm trees. It was a space designed exclusively for the ultra-wealthy, a space that demanded respect and absolute decorum. Standing right in the middle of this pristine environment, looking entirely out of place, were the 3 people who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel worthless. The visual contrast was deeply jarring. The flawless, arrogant facade they had maintained at the steakhouse and the anniversary gala was completely gone. Winston looked like he had aged 20 years in 14 days. His posture, usually so rigid and imposing, was slumped and defeated. He was wearing a wrinkled button-down shirt, his eyes darting nervously around the luxury lobby, as if he expected the walls to close in on him. Valerie was completely unrecognizable. The custom silk dresses and the perfectly styled hair were nowhere to be seen. She looked disheveled, exhausted, and deeply panicked. The proud, judgmental matriarch of the church had been reduced to a desperate woman standing in the lobby of the daughter she threw away. And then there was Maya, the golden child, the sister who had posted smug videos bragging about how her divine abundance was tied to my removal from her life. Maya was leaning against the front reception desk, her face blotchy and swollen from crying. She was not carrying a designer handbag. She was not clutching the arm of her privileged white husband. She was gripping the thin red plastic drawstrings of two heavy black trash bags. I let my eyes drift down to the polished granite floor. Surrounding their feet were several more heavy-duty black trash bags bulging with whatever clothing and personal items they had managed to frantically stuff inside before the county sheriff locked the doors to my property. They had been physically thrown out into the street. They had nowhere to go. Their elite church friends had abandoned them to protect their own reputations. Their wealthy social circle had turned their backs on them. The bank accounts were frozen. The credit lines were completely shut down. The illusion of generational wealth had been replaced by the stark, undeniable reality of black plastic lawn bags sitting in a luxury high-rise lobby. I stepped out of the elevator bay, and the sharp click of my leather loafers echoed against the stone floor. Their heads snapped in my direction simultaneously. They looked at me as if I was the absolute last life raft in a dark, freezing ocean. They had come to the high-security penthouse of the family scapegoat to beg for their very survival. I stood a few feet away from the miserable cluster of my former family. The sheer silence of the luxury lobby stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Winston was the first to break it. The man who had spent decades commanding church pulpits and corporate boardrooms with his booming authoritative voice was suddenly speaking in a fragile, trembling whisper. He took a hesitant step toward me, his hands clasped together in a posture of total humiliating surrender. Winston began to beg. He told me that Connor had been denied release on his own recognizance due to the severity of the felony forgery and the high flight risk associated with the bankruptcy of the logistics company. His bail was set outrageously high and without an immediate cash infusion. His golden son-in-law was going to be transferred to the county lockup indefinitely. Furthermore, he explained that the midnight eviction had left them completely displaced. The banks had frozen their remaining assets pending the massive fraud investigations. They needed capital for a security deposit on a short-term rental. He looked me dead in the eye, his pride completely shattered, and asked for a loan of $85,000. He tried to play the ultimate trump card. He invoked the sacred sanctity of family. He told me that blood is thicker than water. He pleaded that no matter what harsh words had been exchanged in the heat of the moment, we were still flesh and blood, and family takes care of family in times of desperate crisis. Valerie chimed in, dropping to her knees right there on the polished granite floor of the lobby. Real heavy tears poured down her face, ruining what little makeup she had managed to apply. She looked absolutely pathetic. She begged for my forgiveness, her voice cracking as she grasped at the air in front of her. She claimed the immense stress of the failing business had clouded her judgment. She swore they would change their ways. She promised that they would go to family counseling, that they would finally treat me with the absolute respect I deserved if I would just help them survive this terrible dark season. I listened to their desperate pleas with an absolutely steady, unbothered heartbeat. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy. I looked at Valerie sobbing on the floor and Winston trembling before me, and I felt nothing but a profound, icy peace. I told them that their sudden revelation about the importance of family unity was about 35 years too late. I asked Winston where this deep, unwavering loyalty to his blood was when he called my managing director to actively destroy my corporate career with fabricated allegations. I asked Valerie where her maternal compassion was when she stole my social security number to throw a $150,000 party for Maya. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, forcing them to look up at me. I took them right back to the steakhouse. I painted the picture of that graduation dinner with brutal, unforgiving clarity. I reminded Valerie of how proudly she sat at the head of that table, sipping expensive wine that I was supposed to pay for, while she looked me directly in the eyes and announced that she wished I was never born. "You told me I was a heavy burden," I said, my voice echoing coldly off the marble walls. "You told me I contributed absolutely nothing to your perfect elite image. You threw me away to protect the fragile ego of a man who is currently sitting in a holding cell for forging my name. You spent my entire life using me as a stepping stone to elevate yourselves, and now you want me to fund your rescue operation." Maya let out a loud, pathetic sob, dropping one of her heavy black trash bags onto the floor. She begged me to have mercy, crying that her entire life was ruined, that her friends had blocked her number, and that she had absolutely nowhere to sleep tonight. I looked at my younger sister, the golden child who had spent her entire existence thriving on my marginalization. I told her that she built her luxurious life on a foundation of stolen money and toxic entitlement, and gravity was simply collecting its inevitable debt. Winston reached out his hand, his voice cracking as he begged one last time. He promised to pay back every single cent of the $85,000 with interest. He swore on his life that he would make things right. I reached into my designer handbag. I did not pull out my checkbook. I did not pull out my heavy corporate card. I reached into my leather wallet and withdrew exactly 2 crisp $100 bills. It was the exact same denomination I used to pay for my steak dinner before I walked out of their lives for good. I stepped forward and dropped the 2 bills onto the sleek glass surface of the lobby reception table. The crisp paper fluttered gently before coming to a rest right in front of Maya. Here, I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any warmth. For a motel. Winston stared at the $200 as if I had just slapped him across the face with a brick. Valerie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in absolute visceral horror. The sheer insult of the gesture hit them harder than the eviction ever could. I was treating them exactly the way they had always treated me, tossing them a few useless scraps and expecting them to be grateful. Before either of them could utter another word of protest or begin screaming in the lobby, I raised my hand and gave a subtle prearranged signal toward the plush seating area of the lobby lounge. Harrison stepped out from behind a towering decorative palm tree. He was dressed in his signature immaculate gray suit, carrying a thick stack of legal envelopes. He did not smile. He simply walked over with the terrifying presence of a seasoned corporate predator and handed one envelope to Winston, one to Valerie, and one to Maya. I informed my stunned, weeping family that those envelopes contained permanent, legally binding, non-contact orders approved by a county judge this very morning. I looked Winston dead in the eye and told him that if he, his wife, or his daughter ever approached my building, my office, or my person again, Harrison had explicit instructions to have them immediately arrested for criminal harassment. Winston stared down at the thick legal document resting in his trembling hands. The heavy cream paper seemed to mock the absolute ruin of his life. I watched his eyes scan the bold legal print detailing the terms of the permanent non-contact order. He read the clause that explicitly promised immediate criminal arrest if he ever stepped foot within 500 feet of me or my firm. The arrogant patriarch who had spent my entire life barking orders and demanding absolute submission was finally rendered completely speechless. He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing, but he did not dare look up at Harrison. He knew a lethal corporate predator when he saw one. Maya was completely paralyzed. She stood clutching the red plastic drawstrings of her garbage bags, her eyes wide and vacant. The reality that there would be no magical bailout, no secret family vault to rescue her from her own financial incompetence had finally broken her spirit. She was officially homeless, completely broke, and married to a man facing years in a federal penitentiary. But Valerie simply could not accept the finality of the situation. The woman had spent 40 years controlling every single narrative in our family. She was utterly incapable of processing a reality where she held absolutely zero power. She looked at the 2 crisp $100 bills sitting on the glass reception table. Then she looked at the legal envelope in her hand. The sheer, undeniable permanence of her consequences finally crashed down on her shoulders. Valerie let out a loud, visceral wail that echoed harshly against the polished marble walls of the luxury lobby. Her knees buckled beneath her. She collapsed entirely, dropping straight down onto the cold granite floor. She did not care about keeping up appearances anymore. She did not care about looking refined or wealthy or poised. The high society church matron was completely gone. She was just a desperate, terrified woman who had finally run out of victims to exploit. She looked up at me from the floor, her face stained with tears and smeared makeup. She clutched the fabric of her rumpled shirt, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. "How could you do this to your own mother?" Valerie sobbed, her voice cracking with a mixture of profound grief and lingering accusation. "After everything we have been through, how can you just throw your own mother out into the street? I stood there in my immaculate cream-colored silk loungewear, looking down at the woman who gave birth to me. I did not feel a single trace of guilt. I did not feel the heavy, suffocating weight of daughterly obligation that had chained me to her toxic expectations for over 3 decades. I looked at her crying on the floor and I felt nothing but a brilliant, crystal-clear sense of absolute justice. Mothers protect their children, I said, my voice smooth, calm, and carrying effortlessly across the quiet lobby. Mothers nurture their daughters. Mothers do not steal social security numbers to fund fraudulent country club weddings. Mothers do not call corporate board members to destroy the careers of their own children. Mothers do not look their daughters in the eye at a graduation dinner and announce to a room full of people that they wish they had never been born. Valerie opened her mouth to protest, to offer some pathetic manufactured excuse for her lifetime of abuse, but I did not let her speak. I took one deliberate step closer to her, ensuring she could hear every single syllable of my final declaration. I am not throwing you out into the street, I said, keeping my tone completely devoid of mercy. I am just living my life as though I never had a family. Remember your toast at the steakhouse. You looked right at me and told me you wished I was never born. I am simply giving you exactly what you asked for. Consider your wish granted. I did not wait for her response. I did not need to hear another lie, another empty apology, or another desperate plea for cash. The transaction was completely over. The emotional debt they owed me was permanently canceled. I turned my back on them. It was a simple physical movement, but it carried the weight of a monumental spiritual release. I signaled to Harrison with a brief nod. My brilliant mentor offered me a highly respectful smile, turning his broad shoulders to follow my lead. I walked directly toward the private resident elevators. The sharp, confident click of my leather loafers against the granite floor sounded like the ticking of a clock marking the start of my actual life. I did not rush. I did not look over my shoulder. I pressed the call button and waited perfectly still as the heavy steel doors slid open with a soft melodic chime. I stepped into the elevator cabin. Harrison stepped in right beside me, turning to face the lobby. I looked out through the open elevator doors one last time. I saw Winston standing frozen, staring blankly at the floor. I saw Maya weeping silently into her hands. And I saw Valerie kneeling on the marble, screaming my name, begging me to come back and fix the life she had destroyed with her own 2 hands. I reached out and pressed the button for the penthouse floor. The heavy steel doors began to close, narrowing my view of their pathetic broken tableau. The gap grew smaller and smaller until the doors finally met in the middle with a solid, definitive lock. The screaming of my mother was instantly cut off. The lobby vanished. The toxic, suffocating presence of my family was completely erased from my reality. The elevator engaged, pulling me smoothly and rapidly upward toward the top of the skyline. The absolute silence inside the cabin was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. I closed my eyes and took a deep, unrestricted breath, filling my lungs with clean, unburdened air. The heavy armor I had worn for 35 years slowly melted away. The constant gnawing anxiety of trying to prove my worth to people committed to misunderstanding me was entirely gone. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the family disappointment. I was the architect of my own empire, and the sense of liberation washing over my soul was absolutely absolute. Exactly 1 year has passed since I walked out of that high-security hotel lobby and left my former family sitting on the cold granite floor, surrounded by black plastic trash bags. The universe has a remarkably efficient and beautiful way of balancing the scales when you finally stop standing in the way of consequence. I did not have to lift another finger to finalize their absolute ruin. I simply returned to my peaceful life and watched the inevitable dominoes fall from a safe, elevated distance. Connor learned very quickly that his charming, privileged persona held absolutely zero weight in a federal courtroom. When the district attorney presented the mountain of undeniable digital evidence proving his felony forgery, the illegal quitclaim deed, and his massive real estate fraud, his high-priced defense attorney immediately advised him to take a plea deal. He is currently serving a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. The arrogant man who constantly lectured me about building generational wealth at a steakhouse dinner is now making less than $1 a day, stamping license plates behind concrete walls. Winston watched his entire corporate legacy turn to ash within a matter of days. After the massive public exposure at the anniversary gala, his primary investors pulled every single cent of their capital overnight. His Chapter 11 bankruptcy reorganization was immediately converted into a Chapter 7 total liquidation. The elite country club he cherished so deeply permanently revoked his membership. The prominent pastors and business leaders of Atlanta entirely blacklisted him. I went from being a respected, powerful patriarch to a financial pariah completely exiled from the high society circles he had sacrificed my future to impress. But the most profound poetic justice belongs to Valerie and Maya. Without the fraudulent credit lines, the stolen identity, and the corporate bailouts, the reality of their sheer financial incompetence set in permanently. They are currently sharing a cramped, poorly insulated two-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. The women who used to spend their afternoons shopping at luxury boutiques and organizing extravagant church luncheons are now working grueling, minimum-wage retail shifts just to keep their electricity turned on. The golden child and the arrogant matriarch finally have to live in the exact same harsh reality they tried to force upon me. While their fraudulent empire completely disintegrated, my authentic reality flourished beyond my wildest expectations. 2 months ago, the executive board at my wealth management firm officially voted to promote me to full partner. I now permanently occupy the massive corner office with the sweeping views of the city. I did not get there through nepotism, manipulation, or stolen funds. I got there through undeniable, relentless excellence and the flawless execution of my financial expertise. The eviction process on the suburban house concluded perfectly. Once the property was completely vacated, I hired a premium staging company, listed the estate on the open market, and sold it to a lovely, hard-working young couple for a massive, clean profit. I took every single dollar of that profit and refused to hoard it. I channeled that capital into something that actually matters. I officially launched a comprehensive scholarship and professional mentorship foundation. The program is designed specifically to fund and elevate driven, brilliant, overlooked African American women entering the financial sector. I wanted to make sure that the young women coming up behind me never have to fight the suffocating battles I fought alone. I wanted to build a genuine support system that recognizes their worth, invests in their brilliance, and ensures they never have to shrink themselves to make mediocre people feel comfortable. Tonight, I am standing on the expansive wrap-around balcony of my luxury penthouse. The warm Georgia evening air is perfectly still, and the glittering skyline of Atlanta stretches out infinitely before me. I am not standing here alone. Kendra is standing to my right, looking absolutely radiant in a sleek summer dress, laughing as she pours us another round of vintage champagne. Harrison is standing to my left, leaning against the thick glass railing, with a look of profound, paternal pride on his face. This is my chosen family. These are the people who value my presence, respect my boundaries, and celebrate my authentic success without a single drop of jealousy. I look out over the glowing city and take a deep, unrestricted breath. For 35 years, I carried the heavy, toxic burden of believing that I was the problem. I thought my inability to secure the love of my mother was a personal failure. But standing here now, completely surrounded by peace and unbothered prosperity, I finally understand the absolute truth. I did not destroy my family. Their own profound toxicity, their endless greed, and their blinding arrogance destroyed them. They built a fragile, hollow house of cards out of stolen money and bitter lies. I did not knock it down. I simply stopped holding up the walls. I handed them a mirror and they shattered their own reflection. I protected my peace. I defined my own absolute worth. And out of the ashes of their rejection, I built a magnificent, untouchable empire that they will never ever be allowed to enter. The greatest lesson I learned from this ordeal is that sharing DNA does not give anyone a free pass to disrespect or exploit you. For decades, I allowed my family to dim my light because I believed the lie that maintaining peace was more important than protecting my own well-being. I thought shrinking myself would eventually earn their love. But toxic people do not want you to succeed. They want you to remain small so they can feel big. Walking away from my parents and sister was the most painful decision of my life, but it was absolutely necessary. True family is not determined by bloodlines. It is built on mutual respect, genuine support, and unconditional love. The most empowering thing you can do is stop fighting for a seat at a table where you are not valued and simply build your own empire instead. Protect your peace at all costs, because authentic success is the absolute best revenge and the ultimate justice. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your peace and sanity? Please share your story in the comments below and hit like and subscribe for more journeys of healing today.